Hey everybody, I hope that you're having a wonderful day today. Today we are here to cover the Endocrine Lab. This is our first lab in the semester. We're going to use images from our textbook mainly, and we will use only one image from our lab manual or our images book, excuse me. So, make sure that you're following along. And if you look for me, this is in the 2018 version of our lab manual. This is on page 25. And if you notice, there's really only about 2/3 of a page of information. So this is not a very long lab. And that's something that we're going to start to see more and more into 11. The labs are a little bit less intense, and the lectures are going to be a little bit more intense. So be prepared for that as we move through. But let's go ahead and let's begin here with this endocrine lab. First off, let's look at the basic image, and you may need to zoom in a little bit on this, but you really should know any term that's in our lab manual that's on this picture. You should be able to identify every gland. So let's just start with our list. The first one is the pituitary gland. Here we kind of see Elvis chicken's. Hold on, let me get the pointer up. Sorry about that. Here is the pituitary gland. Here, right above it, we kind of see that W-shaped hypothalamus as well. So Elvis chicken's beak is the hypothalamus, or the diencephalon, that W-shaped structure, is the hypothalamus, and hanging off of it is the pituitary. Now I'm going to give you better images of these two for the test, or here in just a second, and also for the test. But you should make sure that you know these from here as well. Behind that, and this is kind of a giveaway, towards the front there's two, towards the back there's one. So if you're looking at this, you can kind of tell which one is the pineal and which one's the pituitary. Towards the back of the diencephalon, here is the back of the corpus callosum. There is that little knotted up pineal gland, which is important for melatonin production to help set your sleep and wake cycle, your circadian rhythms. Again, from lecture we've already mentioned, I should review that real quick as well. The hypothalamus is the control center of the endocrine system. And then this pituitary gland right here, we're going to talk about the anterior and posterior portion in another image, but this is the master gland. This tends to control a lot of the other glands. Now, as we move down, we see the thyroid gland. So here is the thyroid. And if we looked on the back side of the thyroid, that's what this image is showing us over here. This is showing us a posterior view, posterior surface of the thyroid gland. And we see these four very small bean-shaped structures. These are the parathyroid glands on the backside of the thyroid. So the thyroid is important to produce thyroid hormones that are involved with metabolism, stimulating metabolism in most cells of the body. But also they have those C cells, if you remember, and those C cells are going to make calcitonin, and calcitonin helps to lower the calcium that's floating in your bloodstream. Now, on the backside, those parathyroid glands, these guys are producing parathyroid hormone, PTH. And what that does is it does the opposite, raises the calcium that's floating in your bloodstream. So these two, the parathyroids and the thyroid, control your blood calcium, kind of like that insulin and glucagon controls your blood sugar. It's basically the same kind of concept. They're antagonists. Now, as we move on down, we see the thymus. This is the only view of the thymus we have. As well, I should point out, this is the only view of the pineal gland we're going to have. And this is the only view of the parathyroids that we're going to have. Okay. So again, the third thing that we're only going to see here is going to be this thymus. So the thymus is up towards the base of the heart, towards the top of the heart. And we'll talk about that in our next lab, where the base and the apex are. But here's the thymus, and the thymus is really important mainly for immunity. But what happens as we grow older, the thymus atrophies. It starts to get smaller, and as a result, our immunity starts to get weaker as we get older. And so this thymus is important, especially at younger age, to help develop your immunity. And it does produce a hormone called thymosin that helps with that and helps with coordinating some of the immune responses. As we move on down, it might be tough to see, but right here is the duodenum, or the duodenum after the stomach, and we can always find the pancreas because it is wrapped around by that duodenum. Okay, so there is the pancreas. Now that's the only view of the pancreas we're going to have, but we're going to have a internal view of the pancreas to kind of show us some of the cells that are acting. There's two groups of cells in there, alpha and beta cells. Beta cells make insulin, and insulin is what lowers the glucose that's roaming free in your bloodstream, right? So it really just opens up these channels to allow that sugar to go out of the bloodstream, to put it into the tissues. But then it also has these alpha cells that produce glucagon. Glucagon is the antagonist for insulin. Instead of lowering blood glucose, glucagon raises blood glucose. In times when you don't eat for very long, then glucagon kicks in to release your stored glucoses, your stored glycogens, so that you can maintain your blood glucose levels. Okay, and again, we've mentioned that in lecture. The first one that you're responsible for is going to be these adrenal glands. So here are the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands have two different regions. Here we can also see a adrenal gland, so either here on top of the kidneys in kind of the background, or up here we see those adrenals. Again, there's two regions. The adrenal medulla is the central region. This produces adrenaline, and adrenaline is really the combination of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so epinephrine and norepinephrine, these are what cause that fight or flight stimulation. They're more stimulatory, and they really cause a lot of sugars to be dumped, fuels to be dumped into your bloodstream to have the extra energy for your muscular and your nervous system. This outer region is the adrenal cortex, and as we mentioned in lecture, this is the other place besides the gonads where steroids are made in the body. So the adrenal cortex, we notice, is yellow, and that's because it's using cholesterol, that fat, to make those steroids. And so we'll talk about those corticosteroids and the different regions of that when we get a little bit more in depth. But again, there's a handful of these things: pineal, thymus, parathyroids, and maybe the pancreas itself that we can only see from this image. All right. Next, I don't have, and I apologize, I don't have just this. Say, this is all that I wanted to show you, was this slide right here, but I don't have that for some reason. I can't find it. So when we look at this, I want you to realize here, all this extra stuff is not going to be here on the test. So if you can, and I'm going to zoom in. Okay, so if you can, zoom in. I don't know if this is going to zoom for you or not, but I'm going to try to zoom in as much as I can. When we look here, here is the W-shaped portion of the diencephalon, right? If you were in my 210 class, we talked about Elvis chicken, how the diencephalon looked like an Elvis chicken head. And so this would be his beak, right? So that's the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus connects to this gland here, and this whole structure is the pituitary gland that connects through this stalk, right? This kind of little connector, and this is called the infundibulum. So the infundibulum is this stalk here that kind of connects the hypothalamus down to the pituitary gland. Now, when we look at this, we can notice that the hypothalamus is this kind of brownish, grayish color, right? And if you notice, it actually extends through the infundibulum and it expands to create the posterior pituitary. If you remember from lecture, we mentioned that the hormones that are released at the posterior pituitary are actually made by the hypothalamus. And so there's just neurons that go down through here. And these neurons think that they're spitting into synapses, they're secreting into synapses. But actually what they're doing is secreting into the bloodstream. And so as a result, those neurotransmitters become hormones. Okay? Now, we notice this other coloration though, and that's telling us that these are two different tissues. This is mainly nervous tissue still, but this is becoming true endocrine tissue. This kind of golden copper portion towards the front, this is the anterior pituitary. Now again, I'm going to zoom out, and as I zoom out, we can see that the anterior pituitary controls a lot of these other glands and organs, and as a result, that's part of the reason why we call this whole pituitary gland the master gland. Okay. Now, you can call it, I prefer you call it the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. You can call it the posterior lobe of the pituitary, but you have to spell all that out. You can call it anterior lobe of pituitary, but you have to spell all that out. If you put anterior lobe, it's wrong. If you put posterior lobe, it's 100% wrong, okay? Because you're not telling me the details that I need on the test. So make sure you don't fall into that trap, okay? Start calling it ant pit and post pit, and you'll be good. Okay, here's the thyroid gland. Here is more of the gross anatomy of the thyroid gland. When we look at it, we've got a big chunk on this side and a big chunk on that side. So that gives us a right lobe and a left lobe. Remember, this is an anatomic position. So left lobe, right lobe, and in the middle is going to be a connector. And just like in geography, a land bridge, if you don't know, it's referred to as an isthmus. And so this is an isthmus, right? So here, this is the isthmus that connects the two lobes of the thyroid. Now, as we look inside this thyroid gland, we're going to see these circles. Now, again, in 3 dimension, these are spheres. These are not circles. And so it's kind of doming out towards you and doming out past this. And so we've got a pocket, and this entire sphere is called a thyroid follicle. Don't forget, from lecture, we discussed how thyroid follicles are where we're going to produce the thyroid hormones. And so that iodine comes from the capillary through the cells, through these simple cuboidal cells, and these are called follicular cells. Okay, so the cells that surround the follicle are called follicular cells. That iodine goes through the follicular cells and it binds into the middle here. And in here, there's a protein. And so this protein-rich solution, it's kind of peachish color. This inside of the follicle is filled with colloid. So the colloid is the fluid in there, and that fluid contains that thyroglobulin. We bind that iodine with the thyroglobulin, and we made our hormone. Then we can just release it back into the bloodstream whenever we need it. Okay, hanging outside of these follicles, we see these whitish cells. These are our parafollicular cells. So these are parafollicular or C cells. These are the ones that make the calcitonin. And as we mentioned just a second ago, calcitonin works with PTH to kind of regulate your blood calcium levels. Now, I know that pancreas may be next on our list, but I have the adrenal glands next. Here again, I wanted to point out, and this image may not show up on the test, but I just wanted to use it to make sure that you understood that the adrenal glands, they're also referred to as the suprarenal glands. These are on top of your kidneys, which are the renals, and that's why the term suprarenal is sometimes used. But here, let's chop these jokers open. Again, when we look at it, those guys are yellow, right? So the outer layer is where we make those steroids. This is called the adrenal cortex. The inner layer is where we make adrenaline, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, and that is called the adrenal medulla. Now, for some reason, under cortex, we have the word capsule. Capsule should be separated. It is a separate part, kind of like the medulla and the cortex. The capsule is always the outermost layer. So this is not part of the cortex. I'm not sure why it's listed like that in our lab manual, but it just is. So realize, here's the adrenal capsule, or just the capsule, and this is always an outer covering of any organ. That's how we determine if it's an organ versus just a tissue, is if it has its own capsule. Okay, now if we take, and if you notice, and that there is a little bit missing here, but if you notice, we're going to take a cut from the adrenal cortex. The top should be the capsule and the bottom should be the medulla. Let's look. Top is capsule, bottom is medulla. So in between, we see these 3 layers, and those 3 layers comprise our adrenal cortex. So these are the 3 regions where we make those over 25 different corticosteroids. The outermost layer here is this zona glomerulosa. You notice it's a little different color, even a little peachish color. Zona glomerulosa is where we made aldosterone. Remember, aldosterone wants to conserve sodium and help to get rid of potassium. A lot of times we got too much potassium in our body. Here, the biggest layer is the zona fasciculata. And again, if you look at this, it looks like bundles, and that's what the word fascicle really means, is bundle. So here is the zona fasciculata, and that's where the word fasciculata came from, is fascicle. This is the region that made cortisol. Cortisol helps to manipulate glucose with other cells, but it also acts as an anti-inflammatory. Okay, this innermost region is the zona reticularis, and if you notice, it starts to look like a net. It's got these gaps in it, and that's what reticular means, is net-like. So here, the zona reticularis is where those androgens, the testosterone, is made, and as I mentioned, this helps with, especially in females, helps with RBC production and some muscle mass and libido, right? So all of that we discussed in lecture. So that finishes up the adrenal glands, and the last thing that we have is this image from our lab manual, our word book, excuse me, our picture book. This is an image of an islet of Langerhans or a pancreatic islet, either way. Now this is more than that. This is a drawn image of what a micrograph would look like, a microscope slide view of the chopped open version of the pancreas. Now what you notice is there's all these little purple caterpillars, and in the middle of the purple caterpillars is this island, right? So the purple caterpillars is where the exocrine function takes place, and this island is where the endocrine function takes place. So we have named this island the islet of Langerhans, or again, you can call it the pancreatic islet. I know this looks like it's pointing to that one cell. That is not correct. It should be a circle circling this whole structure. So that's the islet of Langerhans. Now, before we get there, let's talk about the exocrine stuff. Here again, this caterpillar, right? It kind of looks like a weird, funky caterpillar. The whole caterpillar is called an acinus. Okay, plural is the word acini, but acinus is just one caterpillar of these cells, glandular cells, kind of just coiled up on themselves. Now, each of these cells is called an acinar cell. So the acinar cells are here to make digestive enzymes here in the pancreas. And the acinus is just a collection of those to make even more digestive enzymes. And that, again, is the primary function of the pancreas. The secondary function is to make those hormones. So here again is that islet of Langerhans, or pancreatic islet. If you notice, we have 3 flavors of cells in here. Excuse me, sorry about that. 3 flavors of cells. We have these more pinkish cells, we have reddish cells, and we have bluish cells. Okay, we're not going to talk about the deltas, the blue guys, but we are going to talk about the pink and the red. And here I want you to use a little bit of logic. Usually, what do we have issues with more often? Do we have issues with low blood sugar or high blood sugar? Do people tend to eat too much, or do people tend to eat not enough? Okay, let's think about the US and their obesity rates here. So that means that we tend to eat too much, right? So we need more hormone to lower our blood glucose than to raise our blood glucose. So which cells do we have more of, red or pink? We've got more pink, so these are our beta cells. And we need more insulin to lower that blood glucose than we need glucagon to raise it. So these pink beta cells make insulin. And I want you to know that for this test. These beta cells make insulin. Okay, these red cells, they kind of look like little strawberries, right? So these little red cells are, or there's a definite strawberry, are the alpha cells. These guys make our glucagon. And again, I want you to know that for this test possibly. So these alpha cells make glucagon, and glucagon again raises the blood glucose levels. At that point, we have just finished reviewing our first lab endocrine for 211. And you can go ahead and make sure that you are beginning to study this as well as you can. And then you can watch the heart lab, and that will get us ready for our first lab test. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Otherwise, I hope that you have a wonderful day.